Alara Kincaid stood at the edge of the grand balcony overlooking the shimmering skyline of the city, her eyes narrowing as the last rays of the sun dipped behind the horizon. The planet's twin moons were beginning to rise, casting a silver-blue glow over the sprawling metropolis. This was her domain, a world of wealth and power, where humans and aliens coexisted in a fragile dance of politics and business. Her empire, the Kincaid Group, controlled vast sectors of intergalactic commerce, and she was its undisputed queen. Every decision she made rippled across planets, affecting thousands of lives, none of which mattered to her more than the success of her business. Alara adjusted the sleek, black cufflinks on her wrist, the cool metal a reminder of the control she had fought so hard to maintain. Her rise to power had been deliberate, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. She had no time for sentiment or the frivolities of emotional connections. People were tools, instruments to be used for her goals, and those who didn't pull their weight were discarded. She had learned long ago that in the cutthroat world of business, there was no room for weakness. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chiming of her communicator. She glanced at the screen, her expression remaining impassive as she read the message. A formal invitation to a high-profile gala. The event was a celebration of her latest acquisition, a merger with a powerful alien technology firm. The press, investors, and dignitaries from several star systems would be there. It was a moment to bask in the glory of her success, and Alara intended to make a memorable appearance. The gala was just days away, and as always, Alara had everything meticulously planned. Her wardrobe was chosen, her schedule lined up, and her speeches prepared. But there was one final detail to address, an unanticipated addition to her guest list. Kale. Alara's gaze flickered briefly to the small, utilitarian device on her desk. A file from the estate staff. Kale was her personal housekeeper, an alien from the Connor species, an empathic race known for their ability to sense and interpret the emotions of others. He had worked in her home for years, though she could hardly remember when she'd first hired him. He had always been in the background, tending to the daily tasks with quiet efficiency, his presence barely acknowledged beyond his role as a servant. There was something oddly soothing about Kale, but that was the extent of Alara's interest in him. She had never bothered to learn much about him, nor had he ever given her any reason to. He was a tool like the others, and as far as she was concerned, the less she saw of him, the better. Yet, when the invitation for the gala had come in, there had been an odd thought that lingered in the back of her mind. Perhaps it was a passing impulse, but for some reason, Alara found herself deciding to extend an invitation to Kale. It was a gesture, one that might lend her some favor in the eyes of the press. She had heard whispers about her company's reputation regarding diversity, and though she didn't particularly care about public perception, there was something in her that found the idea of surprising her guests with a lowly housekeeper at such an elite event to be amusing. She typed the message with practiced precision. Kale, I would like you to attend the upcoming gala. Please wear something appropriate. That was all. No elaboration, no personal touch. Just the businesslike command she had perfected over the years. When the message was sent, Alara dismissed the thought from her mind. She had more important things to focus on. The night of the gala arrived, and Alara was every bit the polished, commanding presence she had cultivated over the years. Her custom-tailored gown shimmered in the light, a deep shade of midnight blue that contrasted starkly with her pale skin. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant knot, and every detail of her appearance had been designed to exude power and sophistication. The gala hall was a magnificent sight, a floating venue suspended above the city, with walls of glass offering breathtaking views of the skyline. The air was filled with the hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the soft rustle of designer fabrics. Alara moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries with investors, alien diplomats, and industry moguls. She smiled graciously, but her mind was always on the next deal, the next opportunity. Every handshake, every word was a means to an end. As she passed through the crowd, she felt a subtle shift in the air, a sensation that had nothing to do with the social dynamics of the event. Her eyes flickered to the corner of the room where Kale stood. He was dressed in a simple yet elegant black suit that seemed to blend effortlessly into the room. His alien features were soft and unremarkable, his dark eyes calm, betraying none of the anxiety that one might expect from a servant thrust into such an extravagant setting. Kale was standing near a small group of diplomats, his posture straight and attentive, but he seemed oddly detached from the bustle around him. He wasn't speaking, just observing, his presence unassuming yet undeniable. Alara had thought she might feel a sense of superiority, perhaps amusement at his discomfort, but instead, something unfamiliar twisted in her chest. A faint discomfort, almost a sense of guilt, though she quickly suppressed it. She turned her attention back to her guests, focusing on the business at hand, but Kale's presence lingered at the edge of her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow different tonight. There was an aura about him, a quiet strength in the way he stood there, completely at ease in a way that contrasted with her own calculated composure. Minutes passed, and Alara felt the unease grow. She tried to focus on the conversation in front of her, but she kept glancing at Kale, who seemed completely unaware of her scrutiny. His eyes occasionally met hers, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. There was nothing overt in the exchange, just a brief, knowing glance that seemed to cut through the layers of pretense and surface-level interactions. It was disarming in a way Alara hadn't expected. The moment passed, and she quickly turned away, her discomfort growing. What was this? Why did she care so much about a servant, a man who had always been invisible to her? She took a deep breath, pushing the thought away as she engaged with another guest. But as the evening wore on, the unease didn't dissipate. It grew. The gala hall was alive with chatter, the hum of conversation growing louder as the night progressed. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the clink of crystal glasses. Alara maneuvered through the crowd, her every step measured, her smile impeccable as she greeted guests, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. The evening had been going exactly as planned, with every conversation strategically crafted to benefit her latest deal. Investors were impressed with her empire's reach. Alien dignitaries praised her vision for interspecies collaboration. All in all, everything was going perfectly until the disruption occurred. The disturbance began with a low murmur from the far corner of the room. A cluster of alien dignitaries, including a few of the most influential representatives from the Alarix Trade Federation, were standing together, visibly agitated. Their conversation grew heated, the rising tension quickly becoming noticeable to those nearby. Alara narrowed her eyes, immediately scanning the crowd for the source of the problem. She'd seen such conflicts before. Disagreements between species could be delicate affairs, and a slip of the tongue could turn into an international incident. She knew that if she didn't intervene quickly, the evening could unravel in an instant. She began to move in their direction, but before she could reach them, something unexpected happened. Kale, standing a few steps away, seemed to notice the rising tension in the room. His head turned slowly, his dark eyes assessing the situation with an almost uncanny awareness. Alara froze for a moment, watching him from a distance. He wasn't rushing toward the group like the other staff members might have done, nor was he retreating from the conflict. Instead, he moved forward with a quiet, deliberate step, making his way toward the alien diplomats. As he approached, the tension between the groups escalated. One of the Alarix delegates, a tall and imposing figure, raised his voice sharply, his words sharp and accusing. It seemed a diplomatic faux pas had taken place, a misunderstanding that had the potential to escalate into a diplomatic crisis. Alara instinctively stepped forward, ready to step in and take control of the situation. But then, something extraordinary occurred. Kale, his movements calm and unhurried, walked directly into the center of the dispute. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood there, a quiet presence among the agitated voices. For a long moment, Alara watched from the sidelines, completely taken aback by his unexpected intervention. The alien delegates, who had been arguing fiercely only moments before, seemed to pause, as though they, too, had sensed Kale's unique presence. Kale's voice finally broke the silence. His words were soft but carried an unmistakable weight. "I understand the frustration," he said, his voice low and calm. "But the misunderstanding can be resolved with clarity, not anger." There was no force in his words, no attempt to dominate the situation. Instead, it was an invitation to listen, to find common ground. To Alara's surprise, the Alaric's delegate who had been the most vocal paused, his expression softening. The tension in the group began to ease, and the conversation shifted. Kale spoke quietly, offering solutions that bridged the gap between the two parties, acknowledging the emotions on both sides without escalating the disagreement. His diplomacy was simple, direct, and undeniably effective. Alara stood frozen, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to navigate difficult situations, her knack for controlling people and outcomes. But Kale, the quiet housekeeper she had long overlooked, had just done what she could not. He had defused a potentially catastrophic diplomatic disaster with nothing but calm words and the ability to listen. The group of diplomats slowly began to settle, their voices lowering as Kale continued to speak with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Alara, still watching from the periphery, felt a wave of conflicting emotions flood over her. First, there was disbelief. How had Kale, of all people, known exactly what to say, how to ease the tension? Then there was admiration, creeping up from somewhere deep within her, an emotion she was not accustomed to feeling toward anyone. She had always been the one who controlled the room, the one who dictated the terms of every interaction. And yet here was Kale, effortlessly commanding the respect of everyone around him with nothing more than his presence. Her discomfort was palpable, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The situation was under control. The delegates were nodding in agreement. The tension between them dissolved. Kale, in his quiet way, had saved her night, perhaps even her deal. She could feel the shift in the room, the eyes of the investors now on her, expecting her to take credit for the resolution. But Alara didn't feel victorious. She felt unsettled. She turned away from the group, excusing herself from the scene, and made her way to a private corner of the hall. She needed a moment to collect herself. As she reached the edge of the room, she felt Kale's presence behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know he was there. His calm, steady energy seemed to fill the space between them. "Thank you," Alara said, her voice cool, but there was a faint tremor in it, a crack in the armor she'd so carefully built over the years. "I didn't expect you to handle it like that." Kale's response was simple. "I just did what needed to be done." She nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Her pride, her confidence, everything that had made her the powerful woman she was, seemed to falter in the face of his quiet competence. She had never thought much about Kale beyond his utility. He had been a background figure in her life, a servant who was invisible, always there but never noticed. Now she couldn't help but notice him. As the night wore on, Alara found herself glancing toward Kale more than once. She saw him standing alone, quietly observing the guests, his presence somehow calming amidst the chaos. She watched him interact with a few of the other staff, his manner never shifting from that same quiet, composed demeanor. He wasn't doing anything spectacular, yet there was something about him that drew her attention. There was a depth to him that she hadn't realized before, something that set him apart from the others. For the rest of the evening, Alara tried to focus on the business at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Kale. She felt a strange unease growing within her, as if she were on the edge of something she couldn't quite define. She didn't like it. She didn't like feeling vulnerable, unsure, or dependent on anyone, least of all Kale. But the more she tried to push the thought away, the more it lingered, gnawing at her. The evening came to a close, and as the guests began to file out, Alara lingered for a moment, watching Kale quietly oversee the final preparations for the event's end. The gala had been a success, but she couldn't shake the strange sense of confusion that had settled over her. She had invited Kale to this event expecting him to be an inconsequential backdrop, but he had proven, in his own quiet way, to be far more than that. As she walked out of the hall, her mind remained focused on Kale, the one person who had somehow shifted the entire course of her evening. She was unsettled, and that, more than anything, troubled her deeply. The morning after the gala, Alara woke up with a headache, the kind that settled deep behind her eyes and refused to go away no matter how much she tried to will it. Her apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight to block out the sun, and yet she could still feel the weight of the night pressing on her. The lingering tension, the sense of discomfort that had gnawed at her during the gala, had followed her home. She had managed to push it aside last night, swept it under the rug like she did with everything else that didn't fit into her carefully constructed world. But now, in the stillness of her penthouse, it refused to be ignored. She sat up, rubbing her temples as she tried to gather her thoughts. Cale's face flashed in her mind, his calm expression, his unshakable composure as he had stood in the middle of that diplomatic standoff. The memory made her chest tighten in a way that both unsettled and frustrated her. What was it about him that was so different? Why had his presence thrown her off so completely? It didn't make sense. He was just a housekeeper, an employee, nothing more. She had never once considered him anything but a background figure in her life, a utility to keep her home running smoothly. And yet, after last night, she couldn't seem to shake the feeling that she had misjudged him. Or perhaps it wasn't just that. Perhaps it was the growing realization that she had been wrong about more than just Cale. She had spent so much of her life building an empire, stacking success upon success, pushing people aside when they no longer served her purpose, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with someone. She had been so focused on power, on control, that she had failed to see the value of empathy, of actually listening to people, of understanding them. Cale, of all people, had reminded her of that. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, snapping her from her thoughts. She grabbed it, glancing at the message. It was a reminder about the meeting with her top investors later in the afternoon. Business, always business. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the familiar weight of responsibility. But this time, there was something else mixed in with her usual resolve. A sense of dread, a sense of being out of her depth. She pushed it away, focusing on the task at hand. The meeting was scheduled to take place at one of the most prestigious conference centers in the city. Alara had every detail planned, from the guest list to the presentation slides. The investors would arrive, nod at her plans, and then they would leave, just like always. She knew how to navigate these interactions. She always had. What she didn't know, however, was how to handle the increasing pull she felt toward Cale. The thought of seeing him again unsettled her. She had invited him to the gala to prove a point, to shake things up and show her guests that she was a woman who valued inclusivity. But now that the night was over, she couldn't help but feel exposed. Alara's morning passed in a blur of meetings and calls, the details of her business world requiring her full attention. But even as she spoke with her team and reviewed reports, her thoughts kept drifting back to Cale. She had decided to keep her distance from him after the gala. She didn't want to complicate things, didn't want to acknowledge the strange, unsettling feelings he had stirred in her. But that decision was easier said than done. As she made her way to the conference center, she found herself scanning the room for his presence, her gaze flicking from person to person. It was absurd. Cale had no place in this world, no role to play in the high-stakes game of intergalactic commerce that she navigated with ease. He was just a servant, an employee, someone who lived in the background of her life. But there was something about him that lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. The investors began arriving, their faces familiar and cold. Alara greeted them with her usual poise, her professional mask slipping into place with practiced ease. The meeting proceeded without incident, the usual discussions about market trends and future acquisitions unfolding just as expected. And yet, despite the routine nature of the event, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Her thoughts kept slipping back to Cale, his calm, his quiet power, the way he had taken control of that situation at the gala without even trying. She had watched him the entire night, and it had unnerved her. She didn't like feeling vulnerable, didn't like the idea that someone like him could affect her so deeply. At some point during the meeting, her assistant entered the room with a quiet knock, handing her a tablet with the latest projections for the quarter. Alara took it without looking up, her eyes scanning the data for anything that needed her immediate attention. She was aware of her surroundings, but her thoughts remained elsewhere, drifting back to Kale, to the strange feeling she couldn't seem to shake. After the meeting ended, Alara found herself walking through the quiet halls of the conference center, her steps deliberate but slow. She needed to clear her head to reset. But as she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a figure who was coming out of the staff-only area. She stopped abruptly, her heart skipping a beat when she saw who it was. Kale. He was standing there, looking as calm and composed as ever. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. "I didn't expect to see you here," Alara said, her voice cool but laced with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite identify. It was a statement, not a question, but Kale didn't seem to mind. "I'm here to assist with the catering," he replied simply. His voice was soft, steady, and unbothered by the fact that he had just bumped into the most powerful woman in the room. Alara couldn't help but notice how at ease he was, how his presence seemed to fill the space without demanding it. She nodded, though her mind was already elsewhere. "I see." There was an awkward pause between them, a hesitation that stretched on longer than either of them had anticipated. Alara felt it, the weight of the silence, and yet she couldn't bring herself to move past it. There was something about Kale that unsettled her, a vulnerability in his calmness, a strength in his restraint. It was as though he saw through her, saw the cracks in her perfect facade, and yet he said nothing about them. Finally, Kale spoke again. "If you need anything, I'll be nearby." His words were simple, polite, but there was something deeper in them, something unspoken that lingered between them. Alara nodded again, her throat tight. She had no idea what she was feeling, only that it was more complicated than she could easily explain. She had spent so long building her walls, keeping everything at a distance, but Kale was different. She could feel it now more than ever. As he turned and walked away, Alara remained rooted to the spot, watching him disappear down the hallway. She didn't know what to make of the feelings that had begun to bubble up inside her, only that they were undeniable, and that terrified her. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the image of Kale, his quiet presence and unexpected wisdom, stayed with her, gnawing at her from the inside. She had tried to suppress it, to ignore it, but now there was no turning back. Something had shifted between them, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She would have to face it eventually, but for now she had no idea how. The rain poured steadily against the glass walls of Alara's penthouse, the rhythm a constant, soothing backdrop to her restless thoughts. She stood at the edge of her living room, arms crossed, staring out at the city below. Its lights flickered like 1,000 tiny stars, but she felt none of their brilliance. Her mind was elsewhere, back at the conference center, lingering in that quiet moment with Kale. She hated how it stayed with her, how it wormed its way into her thoughts despite her best efforts to bury it. He had been so unassuming, so composed, and yet his presence seemed to have an undeniable weight. It unnerved her. She wasn't used to being affected by anyone, least of all someone like him. She should have been able to brush it off, to file the moment away as insignificant. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the way he had looked at her. It wasn't admiration or deference. It wasn't fear or awe. It was understanding, as though he could see right through her, past the walls she had so carefully constructed. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to turn away from the window. There was no use dwelling on it. Kale was just a housekeeper, an employee. His calmness, his insight, it didn't mean anything. He wasn't a part of her world. He couldn't be. She had spent too long building herself into who she was now, and there was no room for someone like him in that equation. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Alara straightened, her professional mask snapping into place out of habit. "Come in," she called, her voice firm. The door opened, and Kale stepped inside, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of tea and a small plate of pastries. He moved with his usual quiet grace, his every motion deliberate and precise. He placed the tray on the coffee table without a word, then straightened to meet her gaze. "You've been in here all evening," he said softly. "I thought you might need something." Alara arched an eyebrow, her instinctive defensiveness kicking in. "I don't recall asking for tea." Kale didn't flinch. "You didn't. But I thought it might help." There was something disarming about his tone, so calm and matter-of-fact. It was as though he saw through her attempt to brush him off, as though he knew she wouldn't send him away despite her protest. It annoyed her and intrigued her at the same time. "Fine," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the tray. "Leave it." Kale didn't move right away. Instead, he stood there, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "You've been tense since the gala," he said finally. "Something's bothering you." Alara bristled, her back straightening. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "It isn't," Kale replied, his voice even. "But that doesn't mean I can't notice." For a moment, the room was silent except for the steady patter of rain against the glass. Alara's mind raced, searching for a way to deflect, to regain control of the situation. But Kale's gaze held her in place, his quiet presence somehow stronger than any argument she could muster. Finally, she exhaled sharply, turning away from him. "You're overstepping." "Maybe," Kale admitted, his tone unbothered. "But sometimes, overstepping is necessary." Alara froze at his words, her hands clenching at her sides. She hated how much they resonated, how they echoed the thoughts she had been trying to push away all night. She turned back to face him, her eyes narrowing. "And what makes you think you know anything about what's necessary?" Kale tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I don't presume to know everything about you, Alara, but I do know what it looks like when someone is carrying too much weight on their own." The use of her first name caught her off guard. He had never addressed her so informally before, and it sent a jolt through her that she couldn't quite explain. She opened her mouth to retort, to shut him down, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself staring at him, her defenses crumbling just slightly under the weight of his steady gaze. "You think you've got me all figured out, don't you?" she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Kale shook his head. "Not at all. But I don't think you let many people get close enough to try." The words hit harder than Alara expected, cutting through her usual armor with startling precision. She turned away again, walking to the window and staring out at the rain-slicked city streets below. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, and then Kale's voice came from behind her, steady and sure. "Because I think you're capable of more than what you let yourself be." Alara's breath caught, her fingers tightening against the edge of the window frame. She wanted to dismiss him, to tell him he didn't know what he was talking about. But deep down, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. She had spent so long trying to prove herself to the world, trying to be the strongest, the smartest, the most successful, that she had lost sight of who she was underneath it all. She turned back to face him, her expression guarded. "You have no idea what it's like to be me, to carry the weight of an empire on your shoulders, to constantly prove yourself in a world that expects you to fail." Kale met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what it's like to be you, but I do know what it's like to feel alone." The simplicity of his words struck a chord deep within her, and for a moment, she felt the walls she had so carefully built around herself begin to crack. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, caught in the strange, unspoken connection that seemed to have formed between them. Finally, Kale stepped back, breaking the tension. "The tea will get cold," he said quietly, nodding toward the tray on the coffee table. Alara didn't respond as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She stared after him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, she felt truly off balance, unsure of herself in a way that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. She turned back to the window, the rain still falling in steady sheets against the glass. Kale's words echoed in her mind, refusing to be ignored. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been carrying too much weight on her own. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone in. But the thought scared her more than anything else ever had. As the rain continued to fall, Alara stood alone in her penthouse, her mind and heart in turmoil. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Kale had changed something in her, and there was no going back. Alara strode into her office the next morning, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors echoing through the sleek, minimalist space. The sky outside was still gray, the rain from the night before lingering in heavy clouds. But the city below buzzed with its usual frenetic energy. She had buried herself in work the moment she woke up, diving into reports and projections in an effort to drown out the unsettling thoughts that had plagued her since her encounter with Kale. Her team was already assembled when she entered the conference room. The tension in the air was palpable. A major deal with a rival conglomerate hung in the balance, and every face in the room reflected the high stakes. Alara barely acknowledged the greetings of her executives as she took her seat at the head of the table. She had a presentation to deliver, a strategy to solidify, and no time to waste on anything else. "Let's get started," she said curtly, gesturing toward the holographic display in the center of the table. As the presentation began, Alara's voice was steady, her delivery precise. She was in her element, commanding the room with the confidence of someone who had built her empire from the ground up. Yet, even as she spoke, a part of her mind lingered elsewhere, caught on the memory of Kale's words from the night before. Sometimes, overstepping is necessary. She pushed the thought away, refocusing on the task at hand. The deal was critical to securing her company's dominance in the intergalactic trade network, and she couldn't afford any distractions. Her executives nodded along as she outlined the terms, their agreement a given. She had earned their respect through years of ruthless efficiency, and they trusted her judgment without question. But as the meeting progressed, Alara began to feel a faint unease creeping in. It wasn't the usual tension that came with high-stakes negotiations. It was something deeper, more personal. Her words felt hollow, her confidence forced. For the first time, she wondered if her relentless pursuit of power had come at too great a cost. The thought unsettled her, but she refused to let it show. The meeting concluded with the usual round of applause and congratulatory remarks, but Alara barely heard them. She dismissed her team with a nod, retreating to her private office and closing the door behind her. The room was quiet, the hum of the city muffled by the thick glass windows. She sank into her chair, her fingers drumming against the sleek surface of her desk, as she tried to make sense of the storm brewing inside her. It wasn't just Kale's words that lingered. It was the way he had looked at her, as though he saw the cracks in her facade and didn't judge her for them. She hated how much it had affected her, how it had made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. She had built her empire on control, on never letting anyone see her vulnerability. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that control had come at the expense of something more important. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts, signaling a message from her assistant. "Kale is here," the message read simply. Alara frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't called for him, hadn't expected to see him again so soon. And yet, a part of her wasn't surprised. He had a way of showing up when she least expected it, of pushing her out of her comfort zone whether she liked it or not. "Send him in," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The door opened a moment later, and Kale stepped inside, his expression as calm and composed as ever. He carried a small, leather-bound book in one hand, and Alara's curiosity piqued despite herself. He looked out of place in her sleek, modern office, his quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the sharp angles and cold efficiency of the space. But there was something about him that seemed to fill the room, to command attention without demanding it. "You wanted to see me?" Alara asked, her tone brisk as she leaned back in her chair. Kale shook his head. "No, but I thought you might want to see this." He held up the book, stepping forward to place it on her desk. Alara glanced at the cover, her brow furrowing. It was a journal, the pages worn and filled with handwritten notes. "What is this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "It's something my grandmother gave me," Kale said. She used to say that the only way to truly understand the future was to learn from the past. Alara arched an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. And why are you showing this to me? Because I think you're at a crossroads, Kale replied simply. And I think you're looking for answers, whether you're ready to admit it or not. The words struck a nerve, and Alara felt a flash of irritation. You don't know anything about me, she snapped, her tone sharp. You have no idea what it's like to be in my position. Kale didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unwavering. You're right, he said. I don't know what it's like to be you, but I do know what it's like to feel lost. Alara opened her mouth to retort, but the words caught in her throat. She stared at him, her defenses crumbling just slightly under the weight of his steady gaze. There was something disarming about his honesty, something that made her want to let her guard down even as every instinct screamed at her to hold it in place. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her fingers brushing against the edge of the journal. And you think this is going to help me? She asked, her voice softer now. I think it might, Kale said. But only if you're willing to look. Alara stared at the journal for a long moment, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite name. She didn't know why she felt compelled to trust him, why his quiet confidence seemed to cut through her usual defenses. But something about him, about this moment, felt different, important. Finally, she picked up the journal, her fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. We'll see, she said, her voice low. But don't think this changes anything. Kale nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Of course. As he turned to leave, Alara watched him go, her thoughts tangled and restless. She didn't know what the journal would reveal, or why Kale had chosen to share it with her, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or curiosity. Whatever it was enough to make her open the first page and start reading. The journal lay open on Alara's desk, its yellowed pages filled with flowing script that seemed both ancient and deeply personal. She had spent the better part of the afternoon poring over it, unable to tear herself away despite the mountain of tasks waiting for her attention. It wasn't just the words themselves that captivated her. It was the insight they provided into a life so different from her own, yet strangely resonant. The entry spoke of a woman navigating a world of hardship, someone who had built her life on resilience and quiet strength. Each page was a glimpse into her triumphs and failures, her moments of doubt and clarity. The stories were simple but raw, unpolished in a way that only made them feel more real. Alara found herself drawn to the unguarded honesty of it all, so different from the curated image she had spent years crafting for herself. One passage in particular lingered in her mind. It described a pivotal moment when the writer had to make a choice: to continue down a path that offered security but little fulfillment, or to take a risk that could change everything. The words were laced with fear and vulnerability, but also a quiet determination that reminded Alara of something she had almost forgotten: a version of herself from a time before she had become the woman she was now. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the open journal with a mix of frustration and longing. The words had stirred something in her, an ache she couldn't quite place. She had spent so long chasing success, building her empire brick by brick, that she had never stopped to question what it was all for. The thought unsettled her, and she pushed it aside with a sharp inhale, reaching for her tablet to distract herself. But the distraction didn't come. Her thoughts kept circling back to Kale, to his quiet confidence and the way he had seemed to see through her so effortlessly. She hated how much space he was taking up in her mind, how his presence lingered even when he wasn't there. It was maddening, and yet she couldn't deny the small part of her that found it strangely comforting. Her internal battle was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alara straightened in her chair, her professional mask snapping back into place. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door opened, and Kale stepped inside, carrying a tray with her usual afternoon tea. He moved with the same quiet grace that always seemed to command attention without demanding it. He set the tray down on the corner of her desk, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone casual but not unkind. Alara arched an eyebrow, her defenses instinctively rising. I didn't realize my mood was part of your job description. Kale met her gaze with the same calm expression he always wore. It isn't, but it's hard not to notice when someone as decisive as you seems distracted. Alara bristled, but there was no malice in his words, only observation. She hesitated for a moment before glancing at the journal on her desk. Your grandmother, she said, gesturing toward it. She wrote this. Kale nodded, his eyes softening. She did. She was a remarkable woman. Alara tapped her fingers against the edge of the journal, her expression unreadable. She seemed different, honest, like she wasn't afraid to let people see who she really was. Kale tilted his head slightly, studying her. It's not easy to be that honest with yourself, let alone with others. But I think it's worth it. Alara's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze dropping to the open page in front of her. She didn't respond, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had spent her entire life building walls to protect herself, to keep the world from seeing her weaknesses. The idea of tearing them down even a little was terrifying. Kale seemed to sense her hesitation, and he stepped back, giving her space. You don't have to figure it all out at once, he said. Sometimes, it's enough just to start asking the questions. Alara glanced up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what questions am I supposed to ask? Kale shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. That's up to you. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their unspoken connection hanging heavy in the air. Alara felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, something raw and unguarded that she wasn't ready to face. She turned away, focusing her attention back on the journal, as if it could shield her from the vulnerability she felt creeping in. Kale lingered for a moment longer before nodding. I'll let you get back to it, he said quietly, turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Alara exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her thoughts. She didn't know what she was supposed to do with everything she was feeling, or how to make sense of the strange connection that seemed to be forming between her and Kale. All she knew was that it scared her. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to push it away. She looked back down at the journal, her fingers brushing against the edge of the page. The words seemed to blur together, their meaning elusive as her mind wandered. She thought about her empire, her carefully constructed image, and the life she had built for herself. It was everything she had ever wanted, or at least it was everything she thought she wanted. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The rain outside had started again, a soft patter against the windows that matched the rhythm of her thoughts. Alara leaned back in her chair, staring out at the gray sky as questions she couldn't ignore began to take shape in her mind. What was she really working for? What was the point of all her success if it left her feeling so hollow? And why did Kale, of all people, make her feel like there might be more to life than the path she had chosen? She didn't have the answers, but she knew she couldn't keep ignoring the questions. With a deep breath, she closed the journal and set it aside, a small but significant decision taking root in her heart. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. Not for the life she had built, but for the one she might still discover. The storm outside intensified, the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. Alara sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her like the heavy clouds overhead. But somewhere beneath it all, she felt the faintest glimmer of clarity, a sense that she was standing on the edge of something new. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and relentless decision-making. But Alara's mind kept returning to the journal and the questions it had stirred in her. Each entry had felt like a mirror, reflecting parts of herself she had long buried. The words spoke of choices and consequences, of courage and vulnerability, and they forced her to confront truths she had spent years ignoring. She told herself it was ridiculous to let an old book affect her this much, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her carefully maintained control. Even the comfort she usually found in her work felt hollow now, the thrill of accomplishment dulled by the nagging sense that something was missing. Kale's presence didn't help. He moved through her world with quiet purpose, always just close enough to remind her of his steady confidence but never intrusive. He had a way of saying the right thing at the right time, his words striking chords she didn't want to acknowledge. And though she hated to admit it, she found herself looking for him in the small moments, watching the door to see if he would walk in, catching herself listening for his voice. Late one evening, after most of the office had emptied, Alara sat alone at her desk, the glow of her tablet casting long shadows across the room. The journal lay closed beside her, its presence a quiet challenge she couldn't quite face. She was reviewing the final details of the deal that had consumed her team for weeks, but her focus wavered, her thoughts drifting again to the journal's words. She was startled out of her reverie by a soft knock at the door. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Cale stepped inside, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of tea. "You're working late," he observed, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. Alara glanced at him, her expression guarded. "You're here too." Cale smiled faintly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Someone has to make sure you take care of yourself." Alara arched an eyebrow, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to her tablet, scrolling through a series of charts and projections. Cale didn't press her, instead taking a seat by the window and sipping his own tea. The silence between them was comfortable, almost companionable, and for a moment, Alara let herself relax. But the quiet didn't last. Cale set his cup down and leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Distracted. Restless." Alara stiffened, her defenses rising instinctively. "I don't know what you're talking about." Cale tilted his head, studying her with the same calm intensity that always unnerved her. "I think you do." Alara met his gaze, her expression hardening. "Is there a point to this conversation? Or are you just here to analyze me?" Cale didn't flinch at her sharp tone. "The deal you're working on," he said, gesturing toward her tablet. "It's important, isn't it?" "Of course it's important," Alara snapped. "It's the culmination of months of work, years, even." Cale nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And once it's done, what then?" Alara blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" Cale leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've built an empire, Alara. You've achieved more than most people could even dream of. But I wonder, do you ever stop to think about what it's all for?" The words hit her like a blow, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. She wanted to dismiss him, to tell him he didn't understand, but the truth lodged itself in her throat. She had been asking herself the same question, and she didn't have an answer. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her hands tightening around the edge of her desk. "You think I'm wasting my time," she said, her voice low and edged with anger. "You think everything I've worked for means nothing." Cale shook his head, his expression softening. "That's not what I'm saying. What you've built is incredible. But I think there's more to life than just success." Alara's jaw tightened, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked away, her gaze falling on the journal beside her. The sight of it only deepened her turmoil, and she pushed it aside with a sharp motion. Cale watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, crossing the room to stand by her desk. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said quietly. "But maybe it's worth thinking about." Alara didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on her tablet as if it could shield her from the vulnerability she felt creeping in. She hated how easily he seemed to see through her, how his words stirred feelings she couldn't control. But even as she fought against it, a part of her knew he was right. Cale lingered for a moment longer before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Alara let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. She felt exposed, as though Cale had peeled back layers she had spent years building, and she didn't know how to put them back in place. The storm inside her raged long into the night, her thoughts a tangled web of questions and doubts. She thought about her empire, her ambitions, and the life she had built for herself. She thought about Cale and the strange connection between them, the way he seemed to challenge her without judgment. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if there might be another path, one she hadn't considered before. The room was unnervingly still, save for the occasional hum of the city outside the glass walls. Alara sat at the head of the conference table, her back ramrod straight as she stared at the presentation projected on the wall. Rows of data and market trends blurred together, meaningless noise against the growing unease in her chest. The meeting was supposed to be a victory lap, the culmination of months of grueling work. Yet the triumphant atmosphere she had envisioned was absent. Her team shifted awkwardly in their seats, sneaking glances at her while avoiding eye contact with each other. Something wasn't right, and everyone felt it. Alara tapped a manicured nail against the table, her impatience barely concealed. "This doesn't align with the numbers we agreed on," she said, her tone sharp. "What changed?" Her CFO, a seasoned professional who rarely faltered under pressure, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The acquisition team ran into some unexpected obstacles during the final stages. The projected profits have shifted. Shifted, Alara repeated, her voice like a whip. How much?" There was a pause, heavy with tension, before he answered. "Significantly. We're looking at a 12% drop in projected revenue for the first 2 quarters post-merger." The words struck like a blow, and Alara's composure faltered for the briefest moment. 12%? She echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. "How does that happen without anyone flagging it earlier?" Another member of the team, a young analyst, hesitated before speaking. "The projections were based on outdated reports from the target company. We only caught the discrepancies during the final audit." Alara's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. "And no one thought to verify those reports sooner?" The room fell into an uneasy silence. Alara's gaze swept across the table, daring anyone to meet her eyes. "This deal was supposed to be airtight," she said coldly. "Do you realize what this kind of oversight costs us?" "Costs me?" Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment, no one dared to respond. Then, quietly but firmly, a voice broke through the tension. "Perhaps this is an opportunity." All eyes turned to Kale, who stood near the corner of the room, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. He had attended the meeting at her insistence, though he rarely participated in such discussions. Now, as he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that commanded attention. Alara's eyes narrowed further, her irritation barely masked. "An opportunity?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Explain." Kale didn't flinch under her scrutiny. "You've built your reputation on adaptability, on turning challenges into strengths. This setback isn't the end of the world. It's a chance to reevaluate and realign. A deal like this isn't just about numbers. It's about people, partnerships, and long-term vision." The words shouldn't have stung, but they did. Alara felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken challenge in his tone. He wasn't accusing her of failure, but his words implied something worse, that she might be missing the bigger picture. For a moment, she wanted to lash out, to remind him of his place. But as she looked around the table and saw the nervous faces of her team, she realized the truth in his words. The deal wasn't just a numbers game. It was a reflection of her leadership, of her ability to guide her team through adversity. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to push past her pride. "Fine," she said finally. "We'll reevaluate. I want a detailed report on our options by the end of the day. No excuses." The team murmured their assent, visibly relieved, and began gathering their materials. As they filed out of the room, Alara remained seated, her mind racing. She felt exposed, as though Kale's words had stripped away the armor she wore so carefully. She hated how easily he seemed to see through her, how his calm observations cut deeper than any criticism. When the last of her team had gone, Kale lingered, his hands in his pockets as he regarded her thoughtfully. Alara looked up, her irritation still simmering beneath the surface. "Do you always have to play the voice of reason?" she asked, her tone edged with sarcasm. Kale smiled faintly. "Only when it's needed." Alara let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. You have an infuriating way of being right, you know that? Kale shrugged, his expression softening. I think you already knew what needed to be done. You just didn't want to admit it. Alara's gaze dropped to the polished surface of the table, her fingers tracing absent patterns against the wood. This deal was supposed to be my crowning achievement, she said quietly. And now it feels like it's falling apart. It's not falling apart, Kale said gently. It's evolving. Sometimes that's harder to deal with than outright failure. Alara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of judgment. But there was none, only quiet understanding. It was disarming, and she hated how much it affected her. I'm not used to this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Feeling uncertain. Kale's gaze softened further, and he stepped closer, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. Uncertainty isn't weakness, Alara. It's human, and it doesn't make you any less capable. His words lingered in the air, a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. Alara felt the tightness in her chest ease just slightly, though she wasn't ready to admit it to herself. Instead, she nodded, her mask slipping back into place as she straightened in her chair. Thank you, she said, her tone more formal than she intended. For your perspective. Kale didn't press her, his understanding evident in the small smile he gave her. Anytime. As he turned to leave, Alara watched him go, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Kale had a way of making her feel both exposed and understood, and it terrified her. But it also gave her hope. A small, stubborn hope that maybe she didn't have to navigate this alone. The door clicked shut behind him, and Alara leaned back in her chair, staring at the empty room. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she didn't have all the answers, and that maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The days after the meeting felt different, as though the fabric of Alara's world had shifted ever so slightly. The tension that had once crackled in the air around her was gone, replaced by a strange stillness that made her both uneasy and oddly relieved. The merger was still moving forward, but now it felt less like an inevitable conquest and more like a delicate negotiation. She wasn't just managing her empire anymore. She was learning to listen, to trust, and to adapt in ways she had never thought possible. Kale was a constant presence, but in a quieter, more subtle way. He still attended meetings when needed, still offered his insights, but his influence was no longer the forceful weight it once was. Instead, it had become a grounding presence, one that helped her see beyond the immediate crises and focus on the bigger picture. The moments between them, once filled with unspoken tension, had softened, devolving into something more. Something Alara was still hesitant to define. She sat at her desk one afternoon, a pile of reports in front of her, her mind wandering yet again to the journal. She hadn't opened it in days, but its words had stayed with her, weaving through her thoughts like a thread she couldn't pull free. Kale's words echoed in her mind as well. Uncertainty isn't weakness. It's human. She thought he was just being polite when he said that, but now she wasn't so sure. The more she reflected on it, the more she understood that it wasn't just a simple comment. It was a truth she had spent years running from. The journal lay there, just within reach. She hadn't wanted to touch it again, hadn't wanted to face what it was asking her to confront. But now, with the weight of the decision about the merger still pressing down on her, it felt almost necessary. She reached for it, feeling the worn leather under her fingers, the familiar sense of resistance that always came when she was about to look too closely at her own heart. As she flipped through the pages, she came to the part that had haunted her since the first time she read it. If you want to change, you have to be willing to lose something, maybe even everything. But sometimes, that's the only way to gain something worth keeping. The words were a stark reminder of the price she had paid for success, the sacrifices she had made, and the emptiness that lingered in the wake of it all. But they were also a challenge, an invitation to let go of the control that had defined her for so long and to trust that there was more to life than just power and profit. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Kale's familiar figure appeared in the doorway, his presence always steady and grounding. He didn't speak immediately, just stood there, his gaze on her, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Alara didn't know why, but for the first time in weeks, she found herself wanting him there. Not because of his expertise or his calm demeanor, but because of the way he had helped her see a side of herself she had long ignored. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice betraying a note of vulnerability she hadn't intended. Kale stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind him, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was wondering how you were doing," he said, his voice quiet, as though he understood that the question was more than just a casual inquiry. Alara let out a slow breath, her fingers playing with the edge of the journal. "I'm figuring things out," she replied, not sure how much to say or how much she was willing to admit. "It's been a lot to process." Kale nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Alara." Her heart skipped at the way he said her name. It was the first time in weeks that she allowed herself to hear the warmth in it, the unspoken understanding between them that had slowly begun to grow. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, how to confront the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "I've spent my whole life building this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room, the company, the empire she had created. "And now I'm starting to wonder if it's even what I wanted, or if it's all I ever wanted." Kale's gaze softened, and for a moment, Alara saw something more in his eyes. Something personal. Something that spoke of a deeper understanding. "Sometimes we get so focused on the path we're on, we forget to look at where we're going," he said gently. "You don't have to choose between what you've built and what you could still create. It's about finding balance." Alara looked away, her fingers clutching the journal tightly. "And how do I find that balance?" Kale stepped closer, his presence a silent comfort, not demanding, just there. "You don't have to figure it all out alone," he said softly. "You've already taken the first step." Her breath caught in her throat. It was strange, how much she wanted to believe him, how much she wanted to let go of the walls she had built around herself. But the fear was still there, fear of losing everything, of stepping into the unknown without a clear plan or purpose. "I've made a lot of mistakes," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Kale's response was simple, but it hit her like a lifeline. "We all do, but it's never too late to change." The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Alara felt a shift inside her, a quiet, almost imperceptible change. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt like an immovable force. Maybe there was a way forward, after all. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of her empire alone. She looked up at Kale, his steady gaze meeting hers. There was no judgment in his eyes, only an openness, a willingness to be part of whatever came next. For the first time in years, Alara felt a flicker of something more than just the drive for success. She felt a spark of hope. "I'm not sure what the future holds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm ready to find out." Kale smiled, a small, genuine smile that made her heart race. "Good," he said simply. And in that moment, with the city skyline stretching out before them, Alara felt a shift. A profound realization that the journey she had been on wasn't over. It had only just begun.